Hey everyone, this is Anne. This is a special New Year's Day episode of the Culture Study Podcast. At first, we were like, do we want to put anything out on this day? It's kind of a weird day. Also, we want to avoid any sort of, I don't know, cliche or gross resolution content. But then we figured out that we were taping an episode about therapy speak and how, in a weird way, this is a perfect episode for the beginning of the new year. And there's also a great Ask Anne Anything discussion at the end, which is actually about resolutions. So stay tuned. This is a really fun and interesting and complicated episode. I know that sounds weird. It's all three things at once, but it's possible. And I can't wait to hear your thoughts.
Thank you for feeling comfortable to share that with me. But I will respectfully be withdrawing my engagement on this specific issue in order to maintain the emotional bandwidth required to keep my growth and health and well-being furthering in this current period. So I respect you to go forward with that in your own space, but I will be withdrawing my engagement in this current instance.
Hi, everyone. This is the Culture Study Podcast, and I'm Anne Helen Peterson.
I'm Ash Compton, a licensed psychotherapist and cultural theorist, and the co-host of the podcast Bad Therapist.
And I'm Rachel Monroe. I'm a writer at The New Yorker and also a co-host of Bad Therapist.
I love the show. It's perfect listening for when you're making dinner. And it's just a perfect accompaniment and calming because you two are also friends. And I always love that in a show when the people who are doing the show are actually friends.
Yeah, there's a deep bed of references.
We try not to do a lot of lore. Try not to do too many inside jokes. But
well, my favorite was in the intro to the show, you do this 12-minute basically this is what the show's going to be, and you talk about your own bad therapists and the story about the person in Baltimore who. Rachel, you were going to them and all of your friends were also going to them. And so that Ash could get the reference, you said the name of the person and then you bleeped it out after the fact. It's exactly how if I were describing a story to my best friend, how I would do that. So I really loved that. But can you just say a little bit about how you decided that you wanted to do the show and kind of your dual expertise in this topic?
I think it kind of started, it was born out of just the conversations that we would have all the time, just as friends, the things that we're interested in. I think we both share the habit of when we really care about something, all we want to do is critique and dissect it and kind of pick it apart. So, it's not an anti-therapy podcast. We both are in therapy. Ash is a therapist, but we just found ourselves I'm a reporter. I found myself kind of covering stories of just various manipulations and scams, and even the things that I wasn't covering, just seeing so much of it out there and social media, the way that therapy speak is pervading so much of the world. And then, at probably on our 15th conversation, we're like, what if we had microphones?
And I think because my work is so private, I have had so many wonderful open conversations with you about your work that's quite public. And it's been just nice to talk about cads and grifters in the real world that you at times report on. That's not the only thing you do, but you at times find that lens. And yeah, some of these folks desired, or I think required kind of a more critical lens that we could look at with our two expertises combined.
Yeah. Today we're going to look at the rhetoric of therapy speak and how it infuses and I think facilitates a lot of the manipulation that happens, in terms of looking at these specific grifters and that sort of thing. But then there's just this vast well of precedents. And I loved the episode about shadow and shadow speak and shadow self. And I had been kind of aware of it. It's not really on my TikTok page, but I had heard stuff that's related to this. And the way that you drill down to look at, here is where this comes from in Jungian philosophy. This has this is something that we actually is a real thing that we talk about.
Yes.
And Jungian psychotherapists like would talk about it. But then here is how it gets manifested and spread on TikTok in a very different way, right? That's like very, I think, perverted in some ways from it.
At times bastardized for sure. I mean, that's the thing though, Anne, like all of this of course has a root. Like all of these words came from somewhere. You know, it would be one thing if we were saying like, gosh, this is made up language.
Right.
Like, what are you doing? This is just, they're just inventing therapy language. But I think it's more bothersome because there are actual roots and like source material that doesn't get appropriately discussed often. But it's like, these are actual concepts.
And I think that's partly why they are able to travel so far. I think something like, we haven't done an emotional labor episode yet, but we definitely will. Like something like that, a phrase like that is really catalyzes something that people see in their lives a lot. But then it becomes, as it is like transferred onto social media, it just becomes kind of simplified and flattened, but then also like extended and applied in all sorts of kind of wild ways. But the kind of need to name something is at the root of it. And so that's what's like compelling, but also frustrating about the way that a lot of these concepts just are out there.
And I think
proliferating.
We'll get into this when we answer the specific listener questions, but I do think that there is this feeling of like, oh, now I know this word that explains everything. Everything is illuminated. My life is solved. My relationships are solved. And I think that a lot of like, it's almost like a hack, right? It's like a therapy hack is just learning this
It is a
word.
hack. Yeah. I think optimizer culture definitely turns up the volume of this and the speed, the desired speed of learning it.
Yeah.
And like I don't want to speak for you, Rachel, but I'm not against people learning things or learning them even quickly. Like our world is pretty disintegrated right now. So like whatever works, honestly. And again, it just gets like you said, like illuminates everything, but it just still feels shallow.
Which is why you need more and more of it, right? Because it's like, oh, this explains everything, but it doesn't really. So then you need the next concept and the next concept and the next concept.
Yeah, totally. Can we talk a little bit about what we mean when we say therapy speak, just to kind of set the terms for this episode? What do you think of, Ash?
I think of boundary, trauma, gaslight, narcissist, toxic, and attachment. I'm like, I think about this all of the time. So,
do you find that like people that you see in your practice, like, do they come in knowing those words and wielding those words?
Sure. Yeah. Which again, I'm not against. And like, you know, there's also a ton of like pop psych books that have just like, you know, that arena. Rachel, you know more about this, but like that in the publishing era has gotten like more and more proliferated too. So I'm not opposed to, or it's not surprising if someone comes in and they've already read like a tome of information from like some of these pop psych books, you know, or sometimes people are reading like Jungian source material. Like I practice psychodynamic, like kind of modern psychoanalysis type of therapy. So I might not be a good one to answer this question because I feel like I tend to attract intellectual artists, musicians, designers, people who want to be digging in anyway.
Yeah.
But I talk to other therapists who practice more like behavioral CBT, and they are especially sick of the TikTokification language.
Yeah. Rachel, are there any words that Ash didn't use that you would add to our lexicon?
I was like, what a swift and definitive list.
I know. And you weren't even like looking at the computer. Like this wasn't like a reference list.
No, and we did not know that question in advance. That really
is true. I don't have notes on it.
Yeah. Truly off the dome. Truly, I can't think of anything to add.
I we talked about words, but I would also add like a tone of voice. Like there's like therapy voice, right? Or even like I'm thinking specifically of the now viral clip of the press tour for Wicked, where the journalist is like, just people are holding space for this, and like some of it is like this incredible sincerity, and just like if you contradict me, then this I'm so fragile that things will fall apart almost,
right?
Yeah, there's like a reverence, but there can also be the kind of other side of that tone is like a scolding.
What was funny about that clip to me, though, is like, I'm sure you've seen the aftermath, right? Where like Cynthia and Ariana, if I can first name basis them, are like, we don't know, like, what was she talking about? Like, what was even being talked about? So the holding space becomes so archetypal that the space is more important than the, like, you know, maybe the fragility of the moment if someone were to have popped out like a balloon and was like, what are we talking about here? It was like, everyone was just in this like reverie mode. It was so interesting.
And I also think therapy speak is very wound up in the discourse of the internet. And so, like what Rachel said just now about how it's both like accusatory and defensive at the same time, right? Like it's on offense and defense simultaneously, which is a posture that I think a lot of us by necessity have taken up on the internet, but you see it very vividly when you're using therapy speak.
I think another branch of it is the compulsion to diagnose and be diagnosed.
Yeah.
So some of that is like Ash, you were saying, like narcissist. That's a big one.
That's an other diagnosis, though.
Right.
Yeah.
But also kind of identifying with a diagnosis and having that be like a crucial kind of identity, a pillar of your identity, and then also like labeling others. You're borderline, you're an INFP, it can go, you're an Enneagram type 5. It can go in many different directions, like both kind of harsh and just sort of like, this is who I am.
I think that's especially proliferated in like white cis spaces where, right, post like 20, it's embarrassing, like 2020, people are like, well, actually, I have ADHD and it's really, really hard for me too to exist. And it's like, whoa, okay, how are we comparing identity like this? Feels like there was a big rise of it after 2020.
Yes, I absolutely agree. And I think that also a lot of people who are doing the policing in terms of like, you don't have a space to do this. Like there are people who already have like accumulated privilege in all of these ways and are trying to find a place where they can speak from a vulnerability almost.
Yeah.
Well, I am also experiencing all of these different things. And like life is hard. Life is hard in so many different ways. And there's no way that like you can ever win in some sort of oppression Olympics, but that is a way that people try to access that spot of speaking from vulnerability, I think.
Yeah, totally.
So our first question is going to be about all of the changing meanings within this vocab. Let's hear from Corey, whose pronouns are they, them.
How do we combat and correct pop psychology meanings of words that do and are meant to have clinical significance, especially now that losing their meaning has already happened in the broader culture? As someone who has experienced trauma in my life to the point of having complex PTSD, it's getting really old to hear people use the word trauma to mean discomfort or hard thing that happened to me. I also feel this way about the word boundary, which seems to have lost all semblance of meaning in the broader world. Will it ever be possible to have words mean things again?
Wow.
Great question.
Ash, do you want to start with this one?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, as we were talking about, I think the internet acculturation of these words kind of does tend to dilute them. And I'm into the anti-stigmatization and the sort of like democratization of the words. And I guess I would ask the listener, like, in what arenas are you being forced to listen to, I'm going to say trauma dump, which is another kind of like internet-y, meme-y word, but like to have these words like kind of shuffled into your space? Is this at work where you could just like maybe walk away and say, I need to get back to that deadline? Or is it like in a friendship where actually you could hopefully make that friendship more conscious by saying, I don't know, I think owning your feelings about what this does for me is it feels like it diminishes my actual trauma. Like, what are you getting at? It sounds like, I mean, I'm a very frank person, so I would say, like, it sounds like you're meaning discomfort. I feel like through, like, the gentle but firm teachings within friendships and relationships, we can combat some of this, like, dilution.
Do you think that it matters that clinical terms have migrated in their meaning or expanded in their meaning?
I mean, I do think it is problematic because, like, I work in the field of trauma, though I don't talk about it a lot. I do a lot of, like, climate trauma and disaster trauma, so people who are afraid of being impacted by the climate change, macro changes or who already have. but I like hesitate to use that word in like a dinner party setting because I feel like then it opens the floodgates of like all of the other meanings of that word, which frankly, it makes me feel like I'm gatekeeping it in a way. And again, like, you know, based on our like last topic, I don't ever want to compare trauma and be like, well, actually, that's not really trauma, especially from my purview, which would feel like
Oh my
diminishing
gosh,
and
totally.
expertise, like shuffling. Yeah. But, and like, I mean, let's go to boundary because trauma, I think, is like that's an interesting one I want to come back to. But boundary, how I hear it being used in the wider internet world, sounds to me like a rule or regulation often. Right? Boundaries, like this is like, if we want to go to the source, this is like Kleinian, this is Winnicott, this is like self-other, self-object, other, you know, container of safety that a parent or caregiver's teaching you, giving you, and then you're as a baby, developmentally, and a child, you're learning like the boundary that separates you from another person, right? That's the like initial, and there's Freudian, Jungian concepts around this too. There's Gestalt, like personal or contact barriers. How do we make contact with our environment? And also, I am a fan of like, let's say family boundaries, for instance, like, but the way it's used, it's almost like, I don't know if I'm going to say this right, but like, it's almost like a verb instead of a noun in a way. Not quite, but it's like my boundary is you
boundaries.
can't. Yeah. My boundary is you can't do this. And it's like, okay, well, we don't really have control or ideally we don't control other people's actions. The boundary could be, I think boundaries are best when they're silent, actually.
That's so interesting.
You know?
So like people are actively like voicing a boundary when really like they should be
just
not passively,
owning the boundary.
Yeah. And like just making decisions in their lives. Yeah, to enact it. Yeah.
But this, I want Rachel to talk to. I want this starts to get into cutoff language, though.
Yes.
I feel like, right? So I found a stat last week that was saying that I don't know if I buy this. I want to like go back to the source material, but 25% of dads in the United States have some estrangement from at least one of their children.
Wow.
And the article was talking about post-Trump era stuff, you know, and the political polarization. And then 10% of moms have estrangement from one or more of their children. I will find the source and send it to you because I'm a little bit like in disbelief about that number, frankly.
But it's still a lot. I mean, even
it's a lot, and it's
I buy it though. I actually buy it.
Yeah, exactly.
You do, yeah.
I do.
But and like I'm not, you know, this is like this is not therapy talk for the wider world, but like I'm not against having boundaries with family. And sometimes estrangement is like what needs to happen. And I super understand that. It's very nuanced. It's very case by case basis. But I feel like it's become so like, I don't have the bandwidth. I need to cut you off. I have a boundary against this. And then it becomes like a wall instead of like a permeable structure. Like boundaries are movable and they shift based on your bandwidth. That doesn't need to be like talked about to the other person who's receiving the boundary, let's say.
Rachel, what does this all make you think about?
I think Ash was really on point to say, like, where are we encountering this? Because I think sometimes in kind of actual human space, person to person contact, like this stuff will come up and it's just sort of like there's always going to be some language slippage, right? We don't use words perfectly, precisely. And sometimes it's just an approximation. You're trying to get somewhere and you're like using the shorthand. And like Ash said, if it's like within a friendship, some sort of intimate relationship where there's like a level of trust or understanding, you could sort of be like, what do you actually mean?
Right.
You know, like the word doesn't become a kind of a block, you know, from actually like, what are we actually talking about here?
Yeah.
But then I think what can get really annoying is seeing it online, right? Like seeing the slides and seeing the way that these things are kind of used as shorthand or as like content amplifiers. And like for that stuff, all I can do is say like cleanse your timeline.
Yeah.
You know, all you can do,
like
set a boundary and like walk away.
We're talking about people who use like hashtag boundaries, like who are like trying to surface themselves in their content and their messaging and their brand in part by being a person who like talks about boundaries a lot.
Right.
And I think that like when you're encountering it in that way, it's so frustrating that then when you're encountering it with real people in your real life, it like you can bring the frustration to it. But sometimes that person is just trying to like find a way to say something.
Totally. It's clunky, it's clumsy. Yeah.
So one thing that I find myself getting super annoyed with all the time, and I've written about this, is people who say, I resonate with that.
Yes. Oh my God.
And it's very much the younger generation, not exclusively, but I think almost all of it that I see is amongst people who are, let's say, younger than like 33. And I have been so frustrated with it. And a couple of months ago, I was like, okay, so what is it that actually pisses me off about people using it? It's not that it's like grammatically incorrect or whatever, right? It's that I think it actually communicates a real shift in the way that we think about like our positionality towards something that is resonating, right? It's like, instead of like that thing resonates with me, we say, I resonate with that. Like I have an affinity towards that, right? So there's a different directionality. So with all of that said, I have tried to start thinking about like, actually people are trying to communicate something different. And it's not just that like they're using grammar in a way that annoys me.
But do you think that's part of like this is one of my main concerns with therapy talk democratized over online. Do you think that's part of hyper individualization?
Yes.
Like when it's like, right? Yeah. Like
I see myself in that.
Right.
Kind of,
Yeah.
It's like,
oh, for sure. And like that would be my more interesting conversation than just like, can you believe young people use grammar wrong?
Right. Yeah. Well, then we start to sound like sad millennials.
100%.
or Xers. Yeah.
Okay. So I think, Melody wants us to talk about this because I think this is really important. When people talk about actual diagnoses as like a quirk, when they're like, oh, I'm OCD, like if someone's tidy, which is something that I feel like used to be much, much more popular, was very much like, I don't know, late 90s, early 2000s thing was to be like, oh, I'm so OCD. And now I don't think you'd say that. Or bipolar for someone who like has emotions. I don't know, like what's the line there? I also think that sometimes the like soft diagnosis can make someone more susceptible to manipulation. And
to manipulating or being manipulated?
No, being manipulated, like to grifters, to charlatans.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, yeah.
Because there's some level of insecurity and like what you're looking for is somebody to affirm and say like, yes, it's true. You do, you have this special thing. There's this thing about you that you're like wondering about is true.
Yeah. And like here, I'm going to explain this thing that sometimes it seems a little bit like a horoscope where you see yourself in the explanation of what a diagnosis is. You're like, oh, that's
do you hate getting up in the morning?
Yeah.
Right.
And like you don't like washing the dishes?
Yeah.
And then
does your partner annoy you 20% of the time?
Yeah.
Like, it's like,
and I have mixed feelings about this because I have what I will. It's not an official diagnosis, but it is when you when really loud sounds or specific grating sounds.
Misophonia?
Misophonia. And it's a lot, like I've had it my entire life and I've never had an explanation for why I reacted the way that I did to my brother clicking a pen when we were 9, right? Or my partner when he's just like fiddling with the top of a pop can. And now I know, it gets a lot worse during certain points of my cycle. And but then there were times when I explode and I'm like, can you just stop doing that? Like that doesn't, knowing what's going on, I have to think a lot about like, that doesn't excuse me being a total bitch about someone just having mouth sounds. Do you know what I mean? Like it's not, that is not their responsibility. It is my responsibility.
I really love the recent Rachel Aviv book. Oh, what's the title of it? But anyway, I feel like the kind of subterranean theme of it was diagnoses and how when like having a diagnosis can be this real sense of relief and naming and you understand, you're like, oh, this all makes sense. I make sense to myself. But it can also have this like limiting side where then you kind of over-identify with the diagnosis, and then you're sort of like, it will always be thus.
Right.
Yeah.
And
strangers to ourselves, right? Is that the one?
Yeah,
strangers to
It's
ourselves,
so good.
exactly.
Highly recommend.
Yeah. And can kind of in some ways like inhibit, it should be this expansive thing that helps you kind of relate to the world in a new way, but it can also be this kind of inhibiting factor too.
I think it's also like part of the problem with all this is like it feels very additive to me. So it's like you have this, now you can do this, and you can time block your way into a new routine, and like to your point, Anne, that's like a total breeding ground for like coachy therapy people to be like, I have a new product for you. It feels very like diet culture in a way. Take this pill, do this thing, yada yada. But like growth is actually like a reductive process. Like we shrink and deflate and shed ideally as we're growing, and as we move to like, this is very Jungian, but move to like from ego to libido, like what brings you pleasure in the world if you are lucky enough to explore that. And so I find it to be like additive, like where all of a sudden I'm wearing like 20 jackets and have like so much gear around how to fix and solve.
So many systems.
So many like ADHD journals.
And
Yeah.
The journals. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, next question that'll, I think, allow us to address some of this. And it's a little bit about weaponizing therapy language, too, which weaponizing is a therapy word.
I know.
But so this comes from Katie, and it's an example of therapy speak in a really public setting.
I feel like a good example of weaponizing therapy talk is Ashlyn Harris's recent statements about her ex-wife, Allie Krieger, and their marriage, particularly the line of being very good at disassociating toward the end of her marriage. This divorce has played out pretty publicly. What are the effects of celebrities specifically using therapy talk so publicly?
Okay, first, let's hear a clip from the interview that this question is referencing.
I am anyone who knows me, I am so touchy-feely. The second I come through this door,
Hey,
I'm
I
hugging, I love you, I see you.
Yeah.
But, like, you can only give so much until you really have nothing left, and you're a shell of a human. I became very, very good at disassociating, and that's what my therapist knew right away. It was my ability to sit and suffer, my ability to disassociate, and my ability to serve other people before my own wants and needs, which I genuinely think probably kept me in that marriage for as long as it did.
Whoa.
The funny thing that strikes me right away is I'm like, oh yeah, I've heard about that before. Like that, like it doesn't sound that weird to me.
It's always alarming when people use their therapist as a character witness.
It's so true. It's like, I can see why it's tempting, where it's like, my therapist thinks that you're a dangerous person for me to be around. It's tempting, isn't it?
Yeah.
But not usually a good idea. Can I ask for context? Did Allie say something publicly first? Not to like tit for tat it, but was there something that happened to contextualize like this like major spill out?
Well, so basically Ashlyn was the bad woman in this situation because they broke up, and then Ashlyn got with Sophia Bush.
Oh,
and so so she's the one who like went to another person. And so you have to explain like, why am I behaving this way?
She wants to defend her character.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's like, I feel like we just have so much more access to everybody. This is obvious, but like our celebrities are like sort of niche celebrities, our friends, our acquaintances, and everybody is like, I think on some level, this is sort of like what you were writing about the other day, Anne, like this impetus to kind of be presenting yourself and like narrativizing yourself in your life at every moment. And like, I imagine that like bigger the spotlight, the sort of more you feel the need to do that. Actually, maybe that's not true. I think you get a certain level of famous and like you don't maybe need to do that.
Oh yeah, like Angelina Jolie doesn't have to do that.
She's like, I'm not going to get into that. Yeah.
But it's like mid fame, you really need to have like a bulletproof narrative. You need to sort of, and I do think that this is like, it's all over social media. You sort of want to know where you stand, who's good, who's bad. Am I on the right? Like, here's the line between the good and the bad. Am I like, I just want to make sure I'm on the good side. And so I think therapy talk, it has this authority of virtue behind it. Like when it's used badly, it has the authority of virtue behind it. And it is sort of like, kind of allows us to like, I mean, this is what the opposite of what actual therapy, when it's good, does, but it like allows us to sort of like split the world into the toxic and the non-toxic. And if you don't put out a story, people are gonna put out a story about you. I'm sure that's
you want
like
to own the narrative.
Right, exactly. Like part of the kind of impetus to go out there.
I should also bring up the example of Jonah Hill. Do you know about this very messy example?
You mean
And,
because
like,
of Stutz and then what happened after that?
well, and like, yeah, like the screenshots of texts where he was like, if you want to wear a
Policing his
bikini,
girlfriend.
that crosses my boundaries, like that sort of thing. So,
and that was really poorly timed right after he had released that documentary where, you know, and like, I don't know. I have so many things to say about visible therapy. You know, that's a whole other topic for another time. But like, it's just really interesting to be like, oh, it was ripe for like, oh, you're not really integrating your therapy, are you? Oops.
But do you think people learn from this? Like, is there a trickle down effect, I guess?
From what happened with Jonah Hill?
Or no, like just like public examples of people using therapy speak? Or is it a trickle up effect where therapy or like where celebrities actually start using the language that like normies use on TikTok?
I think it's probably that. I can't think of like a specific example of a celebrity using therapy language in a way that I was like, oh my gosh, yeah, whoa. You know, like it's not, I mean, maybe I'm the bad audience for this. Like you know, it's my work, but it's never been like helpful in any way. I don't know. It reminds me of like COVID, like when they were singing Imagine and like, it's sort of like, we don't really need you in this space. Like,
maybe you're not the best messenger.
Yeah. The only example that I can think of is there is this famous interview with Jennifer Aniston. I think it was in Vanity Fair.
Oh, I love her.
Post Brad Pitt, Jennifer Aniston breakup. And when I believe he was like starting to get together with Angelina Jolie around this time. And oh yes, it was after Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt had done the W magazine photo shoot where they had been like 50s like housewife like it's like, and they said that they weren't together, right? So like all around Mr. and Mrs. Smith.
Images seared in my
Absolutely. Absolutely. Like incredible peak of gossip moment. And this is also a great example of how huge celebrities, like they don't have to write a caption on like Instagram or like screenshot a notes thing. Like they just do an incredibly high profile interview where they say one devastating thing. And in this case, Jennifer Aniston said very pointedly that I think there's a sensitivity chip missing there.
Oh, I did not remember that quote.
Right? And that like, I mean, I'm sure people used words like some sort of chip, like that sort of thing. But like, I think that was a sort of a moment where people are like, oh yeah, that's a way to explain a certain type of behavior.
Behavior, right? Another word that's very weaponized, I think.
You think so?
Yeah.
How? I just
like, I don't like your behavior. Like, you know, in a work environment or something, it's like, I don't, you know, that to me feels adjacent to the therapy talk.
Yeah.
That's really funny. I remember that shoot. I did not remember that quote, that like searing knife turn.
But it's kind of perfect too, because it's not kind of deploying a trope. I mean, it's really just it's.
That's why she's so original. I mean,
except for the fact that her hair hasn't changed.
Well, it created a wave of haircuts. You know?
One iconic haircut, and then she never has to change it ever again.
I know, it's so true.
Okay, this one is going to be kind of an own, I think, on us, but it'll be really interesting. It's about theories about what's behind the rise of therapy speak. This theory comes from Sloan, and Melody's going to read it.
Regarding the rise of therapy speak, do you think this could be a trickle-down effect from academia, specifically the liberal arts? I went to a liberal arts university in the 2010s, completed an MFA. In critiques, it always felt like when people didn't know what to say about someone's work, the first resort was to approach it from a psychological/Freudian perspective. To me, the rise of therapy speak seems like a natural evolution of that impulse.
Okay. So there's two things that I think are happening here. One is that like a lot of media studies in particular, like if you have any access to like literary theory and like Lacan,
totally
Derrida,
Lacan.
like you learn a pretty bastardized understanding of Freud vis-a-vis these theorists. And then like to sound smart, you can like apply a critique through that lens.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's part of it.
I think so too. I think it actually like, you know, Sloane's asking if it trickles down from academia, but I think actually it probably trickles down from the art world, period, right into like professors who are teaching Lacan and like, you know, the sardine tin and like objectivity and subjectivity from the gaze. And then, right? Like, and that
I kind of think, well, this is like, well, just what happens in MFA programs.
Yep.
I think what happens is it trickles down from Oprah and Dr. Phil, and then you learn in academia,
really?
like, well, I think if we're talking about workshops, people aren't ever critiquing each other's work. They're critiquing each other's personalities.
It's so
I mean,
true.
this is maybe too much of a blanket statement.
I love it.
And it is, and then you just like throw some Lacanianisms in there to pretend that you're not just like basically doing an Oprah.
That's so funny.
On somebody.
I
And
also
so,
think it's because we have a paucity of language to talk about people's art. So I have this memory of my creative writing teacher in college who I just thought she was like the most amazing woman ever to live because she like wore scarves and would say things like I went when I was at Cambridge when she was talking about going to Harvard, right?
So funny.
But she would write all the time on people's pieces like be more expansive but also reductive, right? Like, so, and I understand this now in theory, like with writing, oftentimes you want to expand and then reduce and expand and reduce. But at the time I was like, she has nothing to say. And she's just saying that.
Right. Totally. That's critiques are so that there should be a whole psychological study on critiques in general. I went to my, where I come from with this is I went to design school undergrad before I switched to psychology later on and completed that work. And like art crits are so different from design crits too. And like the way in which you get taken down, to Rachel's point, like your personality can get totally attacked or like people can be hyper competitive in these programs. So it can be like a smart off, but also just like taking someone down through the lens of their work if that person's being an asshole.
But then also, is that connected to the way that therapy speak is used as a sort of like authority off? People trying to like claim authority by using therapy speak in some way?
Totally. I think so.
Yeah, when you're using therapy speak, you're sort of positioning yourself like outside of the dynamic. You're saying like, I'm sort of standing outside and above this and like naming what's going on. I'm not a part of it. Oh, no.
Right.
You know, I'm telling you what's going on.
Which therein is not employing concepts of the gaze. They're not understanding the objectivity and the subjectivity that Lacan was talking about. But
yes.
It's a very appealing position.
Of course. Take. Well, it's distancing, right? And actually, I think the therapy language talk and like insertion is often distancing.
Yeah.
Rather than relational, rather than engaging. It's like, well, again, my boundary, my cutoff, my whatever. Like, I think it's inherently distancing.
Yeah, instead of owning like whatever feeling it's making you feel and irrationality, right? Because irrationality can feel very disempowering in all of these different ways, right?
Totally.
But it's
messy.
Something that happens all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, last question is about work. And I think this is a tough one.
Okay.
This is from someone who we'll just call S.
What are reasonable boundaries to have around therapy speak in the workplace? I feel like in the education/nonprofit sector, therapy speak is abound in efforts to support ethical, accountable, trauma-informed work, But then it gets a little awkward when you have an executive director or professional development consultant who isn't necessarily a therapist, but is asking people to access their deep feelings in front of coworkers in order to increase their impact at work. It feels like this interpretation of DEI work that puts individual effort over systemic change can result in people being asked to bring their personal hardships and trauma to the forefront of their professional identities in order to, quote, show up better in the work. But, like, my employer isn't paying for actual therapy. I feel like I am being asked to bleed out for the mission statement without any aftercare, and it is impacting my mental health.
Oh, God.
This person is saying, like, okay, these kind of DEI initiatives are part of this larger project where everything in the workplace is actually about making better workers, like people who function better under capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So that, like, not so that we can be better people necessarily. No. It's more like
productivity based.
So that you can,
Right. And not so that you like change any structures at the job, but that's so anything, you know, bigger or more impactful in that way. But it's just sort of like you need to look into your soul and see what's there.
Yeah.
And you as the individual worker.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. The DEI part of it is like one whole big messy thing, but just this idea of the like therapy and work is so alarming to me. Somebody very close to me works at a place, like had to do a whole Brene Brown like vulnerability book club thing at work, which is so. And I mean, I think Brene Brown, who I do kind of like,
she's cool. She put vulnerability on the map and shame on the map.
Yeah.
Great.
But she's like, she does a lot of like workplace things. And I'm just like, it doesn't seem to me that the workplace is a place where you should or often can be vulnerable. Like it's just, you're really ignoring the inherent power dynamics there when you're like kind of demanding that your employees kind of open up.
I've actually seen, now that you say that, Rachel, I've seen a rise of, you know, and we talk about this within our podcast too, like there's a cap when you're a therapist and you can only see a certain amount of clients a week and, you know, per your availability and bandwidth, et cetera, so I understand why people want to like mass scale it, make it different, like have different avenues, but it's such a like tricky thing. I've seen this rise of people who have private practices be like, hire me as a, you know, cultural consultant at your workplace, or I'll come do therapy groups at your workplace. Like, as you know, it's just like advertised on their site. Who knows if they're actually doing it? But I'm like, to what end? Like, what are you doing? And this question made me so happy not to be in a corporate setting. I'm sorry.
Yeah. It reminds me, there is this incredible comedian on Instagram. I'll link to her in the show notes, who does, well, she does American Girl stuff, but then she also does nonprofit boss. Like she just does like, you're a nonprofit boss when you ask for like your PTO, like how she declines it. And it's like, because the power structures, particularly at nonprofits, are often so ostensibly flat, but actually not flat at all, the way that they use this sort of like speak to not only guilt you into the fact that like I'm declining your PTO request, but here's all the reasons why you should feel guilty for even asking. Right. Because of the mission, because of mission oriented.
You need to bleed out the mission. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. All that sort of thing. And I like, it reminds me too that oftentimes in these organizations, the real problem is just like the person in leadership, right? Or a person, like a person that is completely like making things difficult for everyone else. But no one wants to do the work of just firing that person or replacing that person. And so instead you have these workshops that cause everyone to go through all of this other shit.
Totally.
Right?
And I think there's like a wild difference between direct engagement, anti-harassment. Like if something is actually going on in the workplace that is like not okay, addressing that, hopefully with an HR person present and not just some outside consultant only, but like what, you know, asking people to kind of like engender the values of the business and cultural humility from the perspective of this, like this one consultant, to build a culture that is diverse and inclusive, which we want all spaces to be, is just like you're not gonna get there doing that. No. And then I often, you know, when I have very rarely been in spaces, whether it's like a training CEU type of thing, I've done like doctorate coursework, where like sometimes we get into the conversations where it's like, oh my God, can you please join an affinity group? Because like, you know, Miranda, you're taking up 90% of like this group discussion because you're just learning anti-racist ideas in here. Meanwhile, all the people of color in the room are like silent. It's just like oftentimes there should be an affinity group requirement or some other way to engage with this. It's not just like forced down the throats of people in a workshop and like awkwardly so.
Right. And like, and to your point, like, what is the point of the workshop? Is it to check a box? Is it to like make everybody feel better? Is it to like, assuage some manager's guilt, or to like have the manager who like wants more of you in some weird, sinister way, which I think a lot of times it is.
Well, and especially in nonprofits like this, like getting around the fact that like we don't pay you enough and we don't give enough, like we do not provide benefits so that you can pay for your own therapy.
Right, exactly.
Right? Like,
and insurance sucks. Like, it often doesn't cover it.
We're going to get around that by doing this like trauma-informed workshop or trying to like institute trauma-informed management.
Right. Yeah, and shoehorning anti-racist, like, you know, unconscious bias, uncovering work in front of coworkers, which is like, you know, not to be overly fragile about it, but sometimes that's just not appropriate. Like that can be deep and traumatizing. Here we go. But work that like you don't really want to be witnessed by like your, you know, cubicle mate. I don't know. It's like, and then again, what work is really being done? It feels like, you know, to both of your points, the like visible labor that some managers or CEOs require just to like check that box.
Yeah. And the idea that like work should be a part of like every single part of your life, but also of your psyche.
Yeah.
And also that you could just maybe like not like your job or not like going to work. That's not pathological,
right?
You know,
So
like
true.
that's not something that needs to sort of be fixed, or you're like, it's annoying to me to be here.
Or you don't need to be like BFFs with everyone. Like if you can't fix all relational modes at work when you might just like not like your coworkers that much and you have other areas that like flex your relational muscles.
Yep.
Yeah, it's a job. There's a reason they call it a job, you know?
It feels like the new, like, remember the We're a Family stuff that people like put the kibosh on really quickly?
Yeah.
Or, you know, work to identify it. This feels like the new, like, let's work on this together. Let's do this. This feels like the new, like, no, we're going to make you stay longer because this took up 3 hours of your workday on an idle Tuesday. But like, it'll be in the togetherness realm and we'll, you know, fix institutions. And to your point, sometimes it's just like the CEO needs to like do the work or something.
Right. Like, or maybe our board shouldn't be all white, right?
Yeah,
like that's
right.
like the easier work. Okay, so our last question is a special New Year's Day edition of Ask Ann Anything. And when I first read it, I thought like I didn't have any advice about this. But after this conversation, I think it's actually going to be really interesting. So listeners, if you want to hear it, head on over to culturestudypod.substack.com and become a paid subscriber. Okay, final question is, what is the therapy speak word that you find yourself using all the time and that you might not realize? And you can say it for each other too if you want.
I know, right? Do we know this for each other?
I don't know. I feel like you're good at
Ash like says it in
quotes,
like when she uses it. She always like raises her voice like it's in quotes.
I mean, I don't want to be too kind to myself, but I feel like I'm pretty good at not using them in therapy speak ways.
Yeah, but you have some manifest in you.
I totally have some manifest.
You have some manifest.
Yeah, what do we call that?
I think you would maybe you would describe it in a different way.
Yeah,
but like,
I probably like appropriate or misappropriate like Buddhist culture by accident, not knowing, you know, like visualization techniques. I probably do more of that toxically, than I do. Like, I don't tend to overuse the word trauma or gaslight or narcissist because, well, for different reasons. I know why that would be dangerous to overuse. Yeah. Maybe boundary is the only one I probably use.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
What do I'm sure you know more than me.
I also feel like because of your work, you're careful too to like misuse.
I'm always diagnosing everybody in my mind.
Too.
I'm just like not putting it. I'm just usually not saying it out loud.
That's your toxic trait. Is that you're always misdiagnosing everyone?
Rachel, that's why I need a boundary around time with you because you're always diagnosing me.
Melody, what one do you use all the time?
I'm trying to think. I feel like Oh, you know what mine is projection.
Oh yeah,
That's a good one. That's a really good one.
But it's always used correctly.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
I believe you.
The bad one that I use is I got it from my partner's describing his therapist's language is recruiting.
Say it in context.
So you're recruiting that behavior or you're recruiting that feedback, right?
Oh.
Like, yeah.
Kind of in a leading way.
Yeah. Or like, this is what you have internalized this understanding of how like
That's a good one.
a behavior should be rewarded, right? So you're recruiting other people to behave in this way.
Mm-hmm.
Or like, yeah.
That's a good one.
Yeah, recruiting.
Uh-huh.
Well, this has been fantastic. Now I'm going to be very self-conscious as I go about my day. Thank you so much for joining me for the first episode of Culture Study Pod in 2025.
That's exciting.
Where can people find both of you, like more of you individually and more of Bad Therapist?
We are on Bad Therapist is on Instagram, and of course you can find us wherever you get your finest podcasts. And I write for The New Yorker. All my stuff's up there.
And our Instagram is Bad Therapist at Bad Therapist Pod.
At Bad Therapist Pod.
At Bad Therapist.
Yeah, we have to say that. Otherwise, it doesn't count.
Thank you so much. This has been great.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks so much for listening to the Culture Study Podcast. Be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts because we have so many great episodes in the works, and I promise you don't want to miss any of them. So if you want to suggest a topic or ask a question about the culture that surrounds you, or submit a question for our subscriber-only advice time segment, go to our Google form at tinyurl.com/culturestudypod or check the show notes for the link. If you want to support the show and get all of the bonus content, head to culturestudypod.substack.com. It's just $5 a month or $50 a year, and you'll get ad-free episodes, the exclusive advice time segment, weekly discussion threads for each episode, which I feel like are getting better with every episode, and a link to a special Google form so that your questions go to the front of the line. The Culture Study Podcast is produced by me, Anne Helen Peterson, and Melody Rowell. Our music is by Poddington Bear. You can find me on Instagram at Anne Helen Peterson, Melody at Melodious47, and the show at Culture Study Pod.